So the product vision kind of dies. Like it's been in maintenance mode for 13 years because everybody's scared to make those big changes. And that's just inevitable what happens in software.
Hey, I'm Nick, and this is the Dude, Where's My Code podcast. Unfortunately, Graham's not here today. Graham was sick, so he couldn't be here, but I did get a chance to interview Matt Watson. Awesome conversation. Matt has a lot of experience with startups and growing companies, so he was able to share some insights about that, and especially taking on a product mindset. So I think it was a really awesome conversation. I think for individuals that are in a position where they're like growing in their careers and trying to maybe look at stretching in some different directions, especially potentially with building companies, this could be really interesting. So if you do us a favor, like the video, subscribe, and enjoy this conversation. See you next time. When you start getting to a position where you're like managing people, like how did you navigate that when you're like, maybe my hands have to come off the keyboard a little bit more, maybe I have to step away from the code a little bit more? Like how did that look for you?
I hired somebody else to manage the people.
Okay. So in the beginning, it wasn't something like an action that you took for yourself. It was like, this needs to get done. I will have someone do it for me.
I was always more the product guy, right? Like okay. I was the one that always had the idea of what should the product do? How should it work? How do we architect this thing? That could speak both languages. So could, talk to the customers, understand what needed to be built, but also could talk to the developers in the language that they would understand and talk about requirements, what to do, what not to do, be able to frame all that up. So, that's where I excelled, was being able to speak both sides of it. But I will admittedly say I was never very good at managing people or processes. I was really, really good at product and architecture, which are more CTO from my experience, are more CTO qualities, where people and process is more like VP of engineering or engineering management qualities.
Okay, no, that makes sense. And maybe a good question then to kind of frame it up then, instead of, how did you step away from the code type of thing? How did you, if you're hiring on managers, how did you get comfortable doing that? Because obviously you recognize like managing people is an incredibly important part of being able to have an effective business, but it's kind of a similar thing, right? Like it's taking your hands off of something. How do you trust other people that you might not know, like you're bringing on, and making sure that they're going to do a good job with that kind of thing?
Well, typically you're hiring them to effectively be some form of project management or architecture or managing people, doing one-on-ones, mentoring. Depending on what your need is, you might have different components to that, right? Or you're like, I need somebody who has a lot of experience building cloud or high scale things or mobile apps or whatever it is, right? Like it could be totally different depending on the type of software you're building. They have this kind of background, this kind of DNA to help the team. Like the team needs leadership, mentorship, management around this, whatever the thing is, right? But I think ultimately a big part of that is usually people and process management is usually part of it, which is not my jam. That's like brain damage to me. So I have a blog it's at visionarycto.com, and I actually wrote a blog post about why I could never be a VP of engineering. I could never do the job. I never want the job. I'm more of a CTO kind of person. Just because I'm just not a people and process person. I'm not a detail-oriented operations person. Just like I could be the CEO of a company, I don't want to be the chief operating officer of a company. Like, it's just very similar, right? And so it takes different personalities to bring it all together. Like, a good CEO needs a good chief operating officer. Like a company's not going to survive without it. Same thing in a engineering and product team, right? You need somebody that has the product vision, if that's the CTO or, chief product officer or somebody as well. But then you need people that are more operational, people and process management on a day-to-day basis, grinding through building the software and getting it delivered. So you need all the different personalities as a key. And I just understand which parts of it I'm good at and I enjoy doing and which parts I don't.
So it's kind of sounds funny when you say, because it seems very simple to be able to have that kind of, I don't know, reflection on, your own abilities. But I feel like some people don't really notice that. And maybe this is kind of the the traditional way that a lot of companies go, where it's like you are a software engineer and eventually to be, continue to get promoted, you must become manager. And it's like, it's not really a great fit, because you said it. It's different sets of skills, different personalities. So it seems like you are very in touch, like, with what you like and what you feel that you're good at, and then you're finding ways to find other people for that.
Well, if you think about a normal software developer, software engineer, or whatever you want to call them these days, you have people that could be individual contributors, right? It could be an architect, a principal engineer, whatever. You can kind of go down that track. Or if you want to go down the track of kind of people and process management, you'd be a director, VP of engineering of some form, a team lead, whatever. It could be a mix of player coach. Am I still writing code, or am I only a manager? And the balance of that is hard. You could talk all day about the challenges of that. But then there's a whole nother track here that's more like product. Like product
Sure.
is like its own track, and architecture is kind of its own track. But I feel like architecture and like principal engineer and all that is kind of its own thing. But product is just kind of its own specialty. And some developers may confuse it a little bit with architecture, because it is similar to architecture. Like, if you drop somebody on a project and you're like, how would you build this thing?
Right.
But if you're thinking about it from an architecture perspective, you're thinking about it more from, okay, how would I deploy this in the cloud? I would use a database or NoSQL, or, queuing, background services, all different things from, okay, how would I architect this thing? How do all the pieces fit together? But when you think about it from a product perspective, all of that is also true, but you also have to think about more from the user's perspective and the business perspective also, right? And I think the key to software development in general, it doesn't matter if you're a manager or just a software engineer of any form, the closer you are to the user, the better off you are, and the more you're going to understand what you're building, how to build it, why you're building it, right? The more layers you are away from the user, the product owners, the key stakeholders, the harder it is to do the job, right? And
Right.
I was just lucky enough in my career, at 19 years old, I dropped out of college to get my first software development job. I went to college to get a job, right? I got halfway through college, I got a job, even better.
Did it half in half the time, right? There you go. That's called efficiency, isn't it?
And my first job from right away was like, hey, you are going to build this thing and you're going to travel around the United States installing it and supporting it and talking to customers. You are the lead developer, the lead support person, everything, right?
So you are the company?
Pretty much. I mean, there was one or two other people, but yeah, I was like the lead. I'm 19 years old. Here I am traveling the country doing this thing. So, but that was like the most incredible experience in the world, right? Because I was never the guy, at Microsoft or whatever big company, lost in a cubicle somewhere doing my Jira tickets.
Right. Yeah.
I was talking to customers every day about their business problems and what the software doesn't do. Yeah.
That was just part of it. Yeah.
We didn't have Jira tickets. He just told me what to do, and I just went and did it that day, and then I sent him a new version. It's a whole different world. That was 25 years ago.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And that's like, it's really interesting because you are automatically forced into what feels like a very, and I don't know obviously the details, but it feels like a very tight feedback loop that you're just dropped into, right? Talk to customer, they say, here's what I want. And you're like, okay, I'll be right back and code it up and deliver.
Well, you're talking about product problems, right? Like, you're talking to the customer, they're talking to you about product problems. They're not talking about code problems, architecture problems, all this other junk. They're talking about the product doesn't do X, I need it to do X, right?
Right.
And so that was, a big difference in my career and how my career started.
Right. And then you get I'm assuming here, but you get some very interesting sets of skills that you can then apply, later on into software engineering when you're going to build things. Like, now you have some perspective. If we're trying to build something to make money, have a business, we need to be doing something that the customer wants. And I feel like for a lot of, and I feel like this is pretty common, a lot of more junior programmers are like I'm very focused on writing code. I want to write good code, and they spend a lot of time doing that. But I feel like some of the gaps end up being like soft skills, like people skills and product skills. Because when you're just thinking about code itself, like neither of those two other worlds come into the picture. It's just how efficient is your code? Does it look elegant? Like, is it the cleanest code? Like, so I feel like you probably had a very good set of skills that was complementary to just writing code, and you were also doing that. So what did that look like afterwards? So after you were working at this company, what was kind of the next step for you, and how did you take those skills, all that product exposure, to be able to kind of move forward?
Well, I would say my career wasn't too much different than anybody else's in probably a lot of other ways. I started doing primarily Visual Basic 6. This was like 1999, year 2000, before .NET came out. And then when .NET came out, I gravitated towards it. But I was doing early ASP, like classic ASP stuff and VB6 work for, WinForms kind of stuff in my early career. But like a lot of developers, I, at some point in time, wanted to also build my own framework for something that I probably could have bought for next to nothing. And, went through and did all those kinds of things that a lot of developers do, nerding out about all this kind of stuff. Now, granted, that was, a long time before open source and GitHub and all these things. Like now, for almost anything you'd ever want to build, like somebody has built it. Right. And it's available on
Open
GitHub.
up a new tab and search for it. It's probably there to some degree, right?
There's probably 3 different versions of it and 27 forks also. But, back then, like a lot of developers went through and did all those things. Like I don't think I tried to build my own JavaScript library, but I feel like everybody else tries to do that at some point in time. But to your point, I was definitely more well balanced. And I think the skill set that I learned early on that served me really well is you could drop me into anywhere and I could just figure things out. Like whatever the problem is, you could airdrop me in. I like kind of like a consultant. And, even early in my career, after 3 or 4 years of experience of like, okay, yeah, that's probably a problem. We can fix this thing. Here's how I would do this. Like I could understand like what needed to be done and kind of figure things out without a whole lot of being told what to do. Like I could just figure it out. And I think a lot of that came probably from my constant product experience too, just understanding how is software supposed to work, what is normal for how these things are supposed to work. And I don't know that I was ever super infatuated with the code. I definitely went probably through iterations of that through my career, like most developers, where at some point in time you think the cleanest, most beautiful architected code is the most important thing there is.
Sure.
20 years later, I don't give a shit, whatever the code looks like.
Yeah. I mean, is it working? Is it solving problems?
Does it work? And then I guess these days I could ask the AI to refactor it in whatever style you want, right? Yeah. You want it in camel case? Let me push the camel case button.
Yeah.
Fine. Here you go. Right.
But so you think, if I heard you right, like probably being able to be dropped into these situations and very, readily be able to navigate problem spaces, in your opinion, that's attributed probably a lot to customer interactions. And would you say that being able, you said this a little bit earlier, right? Being able to speak the language of sort of your stakeholder, like, would you say that was a big factor? The fact that you could hear what they were kind of saying, and maybe it's not the technical level, then you're like, okay, like I'm hearing it at this level, let me kind of transcribe it to like something more technical. And then if you have to pass it off to another stakeholder, whether it's another colleague, a programmer, someone else on a different team, then you're able to kind of just like translate it to something that they're going to get. Is that
and I think a good term for this, I don't know if it's a super widely industry term, but is like a solution architect. Like I feel like I was always a really good kind of solution architect from a software development perspective, right? Of like, you could tell me what the problem is and I can figure out how to architect it. Right. And I don't know if that's a term that's widely used everywhere, but it was a term we used here in the Kansas City area. Like it's kind of like a team lead, project lead, somebody that's like figure out, okay, how do we architect like a solution, a product, product level kind of solution. And I was always really good at that. It's like, tell me, what do you want to build? And I'll figure out how to build it. You just tell me what it is. I can do it.
Okay. No,
And I
that's
think
cool.
that product kind of mindset always worked well for me. And I could also code really, really fast. Although I would say, actually, I was going to write a blog post about this. I might be one of the best developers in the world at writing like the first 80% of the code, and one of the worst developers in the world at writing the last 20% of the code. Right? Like my expertise was more in like prototyping, hacking together the solution. Like, how do we go from like 0 to 80%? I could nail it. I could do it very quickly. The last 20%, perfecting it, making the code look pretty, adding unit testing. What is that? And all these other stuff, like that was not my jam. Like architecture and unit testing, all these other kinds of things, like cross the T's and dot the I's. That wasn't my thing. I was the rapid prototyping guy.
It's funny that you say this because as you were talking about like first programming language VB6, right? And I'm like, that's what I started with. You were telling me, .NET guy for like 20 years. I'm like, I went right to .NET right after VB6. You're talking about rapid prototyping and your approach. Like I was mentioning to you, like I was working at Magnet Forensics with Graham, who's the co-host, who's not on today, and like my entire time at Magnet was literally rapid prototyping all the initial products. Like
Yeah.
until I left, almost every single product that they had that they didn't like acquire was something that I had built as a rapid prototype and been like, cool, like we've proven it. Like this seems viable. You want to spin up a team? Okay, hand it off. So
Yeah.
very similar experiences.
It's a special
cool.
skill set.
Well, and it's interesting and totally, I agree. So we were at the point right before I left, we were forming up a team that was going to be more dedicated to doing this because it seemed like for the 8 years I was there, it was almost like, I don't want to say an accident, but it was like, we need someone to, here's a cool idea. We need someone to do this. And it's a fast moving startup. So it's like, where do we pull resources? Well, we can't. Okay. So who's going to work extra and who can we? And I was like, yep, I'll do it. So we started forming up this team. And I remember we were considering this again from like a management perspective. We're going to say we're going to start a new team that's going to focus on the cool new stuff. What's that going to mean for people that are like, I want to be on that team because I want to work on cool new stuff? And we had to be like, look, almost everything you write is going to go in the garbage. It's never going to ship. Be ready for it to not go anywhere. Like, do you still want to be on this team? And we started to like, people started to realize, shiny stuff, that's cool, but I also like to see my things like come to life. And it was like, that's the trade-off here.
Yeah, some of it gets left on the design floor, right? It's like it gets thrown away as well.
Yeah, definitely like a unique skill set though. And I think again, from your point about having a product mindset, you're vetting those ideas, right? So if you're able to rapidly prototype something to get to an answer from a product perspective, you can easily say like, do we keep going or no, like we're not hitting the mark, and drop it and pivot.
Well, and this is why I ended up being a great startup guy. Like, so, in 2003, I started my first company, which was a company called Vin Solutions, about 3 or 4 years into my career. And that worked really well for me because I was a startup guy. I was good at the prototyping and rapidly figuring things out and building products. And, so similar to you and your experience at working as a small company, kind of a startup is very similar. I just happened to be the founder of the company, and, co-founder of the company. It wasn't my idea. Somebody else had the idea and said, "Hey, Matt, I need help FTPing files." I'm like, "Okay, I can do that." And then built a whole software product, right? And being good at prototyping and rapidly building things is perfect for startup DNA. And if you're really good at that, it's a good idea to go start your own company. Instead of doing it for somebody else, you can do it for yourself, right? If you have the right business idea. And that's usually where finding a co-founder that has some great industry experience, that has the network, knows how to build a product, how to sell it, all that stuff. You get the two together, and that's where the magic happens.
Yeah, that's so interesting point. Again, different skill sets, right? I know I've worked with some friends on the side to try and do like, can we start something? We feel like we have a good idea, start building it, can get very far, very fast because that's what we're good at. And then we go, cool, we got something. Like, what now? And it's like, oh yeah, you have to sell it
Yeah.
for it to be a business. And we're like, well, how do we do that? Like, that's a whole different set of skills. And we very quickly realized we are terrible at that part. We can build, like, you name it, come up with any problem. We're like, sure, like, lock us in a room for a week and we'll have it. But you want us to sell it? We're like, we have to talk to people now. Like, no, not for us.
Well, and that was a little bit of my challenge at my second company I started, which was a company called Stackify. Started in about 2012. And the goal there was to build an application performance monitoring system. So we ended up competing with companies like New Relic and AppDynamics and Datadog. And we built it before Application Insights existed on Azure. You know, we had basically built something like Application Insights before it existed. But selling to software developers was like the worst thing in the world. They don't answer the phone.
No.
They don't answer email, and they will report it all as spam. They use ad blockers. Most of them wear aluminum foil hats in the dark somewhere, right? Like
mine's actually in the closet right now, but yeah, I have one.
Yeah. They're the worst people in the world to sell to. I love you guys, but no, you don't want to sell to software developers, right? You don't want to sell to me either. I'm delete, mark spam.
Right.
Same,
like
right?
I feel violated by the fact that you want to make me think about spending money on something that I haven't heard about. No, it's going to solve my problems too. Like, no, sounds made up. Like, I don't want anything to do with it.
So that was brutally hard for me for my second company. For my first company, my business partners and everybody else were great at sales, and I was the product guy, the tech guy. But my second company, all of a sudden, I was the CEO of a tech company. And I had to figure out, okay, how do we sell this thing? I'm like, oh, I did this before. We'll figure it out. Oh, man. It was brutal. And built the product and still didn't know, like, how do I sell something to software developers? And spent a whole lot of money trying pay-per-click ads and went to dev conferences, did all these different things. And every part of them, like, just got punched in the face. Like, it was really hard. Eventually, we figured it out. Eventually. But
you had mentioned earlier, too, for going back to, like, I had asked about taking your hands off of something, right? Like, when do you know to take your hands off? You had mentioned for management, that was something that you were like, I know that I should go hire someone to do that. In this particular case, was it sort of maybe the life cycle of the company where if you're like, selling is going to be really tricky, we should just get dedicated people to do that? Was it just too early to try and sort of hire on for that? Or
I think looking back, it was, I remember meeting with like a marketing company here in Kansas City, and they wanted like $10,000 for some marketing plan or whatever. And I'm like, that's crazy expensive. I'll just figure it out.
Yeah.
That probably
was more expensive.
That might have been the best 10 grand I ever spent. Or just finding a expert at like B2B marketing, especially somebody that was around IT services or dev products or whatever, would have been the best thing I ever did. Like, just admitting, like, I don't know how to do this, and I value finding an expert that does.
Yeah.
But at that time in my career, I was 31 years old, had sold a company. I had lots of money. Money wasn't an issue. I could fund it, and just figured I would just figure it out on myself. And that was like a lot of dumb, hard lessons where I should have just spent the money and hired like an expert marketing firm.
Yeah, it's interesting because I always say that, like, unfortunately, the best way that we learn is like the hard way. And it sucks because you could have asked someone and they would be like, dude, just go pay someone to do this. You said it. I have the money to fund it. And, someone would be like, if this is not your skill set, go do it. And I'm not saying this like, shame on you kind of thing, because I know that in my position, I would be like, I think I need to figure this out. And then you go through the paces and you're kind of, in retrospect, you're like, man, why do I do this to myself? But you learn so much, right? And you learn, and hopefully the next time you're like, maybe it takes a few times to prove it to yourself. But if I don't know and I can acknowledge I don't know, is it something that I invest time into, money into? Can I outsource it and get someone else that's more of an expert to do it? But there's lots of options, but
Well, the other thing that's hard when you're a software developer is if you're your own customer, it's even worse because you're like, you think you're smarter than everybody else. Well, I'm building this for myself and I know I need this, so I know everybody else is going to need this. Man, that's a terrible, terrible assumption to make, because reality is maybe nobody else agrees with you, or
right.
you don't know how to find people that think the same way you do, right? It's like, just because you like this doesn't mean you're going to walk into some giant enterprise and they're going to buy it. Like, you don't understand the sales cycle, how to market to them. Their pain points are different. It's an enterprise sale. It's a different world. Like, just because you think the problem exists doesn't mean you know how to sell into these enterprises either.
I was just going to say that, especially given your background and product focus, if you were building something that you were like, I would want this and have the product mindset, you very well could have had, the perfect solution, right? And then you're like, okay, back to what you said, how do I sell to developers?
Yeah.
It's like, you're not going to email me. I have ad block on everything. You're not going to walk into my office and knock on my cube wall and say, hey, do you want this? Like, how do you get in touch with me and convince me that I should buy your thing? So sales, marketing, like these other skill sets, like, yeah,
are huge. And whenever I talk to other entrepreneurs, it's a conversation I always have with them. It's like, one of the most valuable things in any company is definitely not the code. It's not the technology. It's the go-to-market strategy. It's the brand, right? I mean, think of so many different companies that exist, how they sell their product, like who their niche is, how they reach those people, the brand that they have built in that space is so much more valuable than the product itself, right? What's usually the most unique about the business model is how they sell the product. A lot of times is just as valuable as the product itself. And those companies that are in those situations keep building more and more products or acquiring more and more products to continue to sell through that go-to-market strategy that works really, really well, right? And if that makes sense from a business perspective, that's why those companies, like, they can't innovate either. They figure out the go-to-market strategy, the partnerships, the customers. Like, you're Apple or somebody, and you're like, everybody buys our stuff because we're Apple, so we're going to build something new and stupid nobody needs, but they're going to buy it because we're Apple, right? Like, that's how the world really works.
Yeah. Well, they end up established. I think you made a really good point, right? You get a channel in place that's effective at being able to deliver.
Yeah.
You have an audience that wants to keep, they're like, yep, this was good. And you're like, cool. There's this other thing that's like similar enough, and you probably have something like this or someone, like there's enough overlap where if we start pushing it through the channel, it's like, here you go. And then you modify the channel a little bit as you need.
And it's the point is, it's like super, super difficult to build that brand and that go-to-market strategy that works. And so in my very first company, we were selling to car dealers, and they were the easiest people in the world to sell to. You would just call them up on the phone and they answer the phone. You're like, who do I talk to? I only talk to the guy who sells cars. Okay, I'm here. Right? Which is totally different than trying to call a software developer because they don't answer the phone. Like, they don't even have a desk phone probably in 2024.
I had a call get forwarded to me. I've never seen this before this week. It was forwarded to me on Teams, and I just had my computer was ringing at me, and I was sitting here going, like, what is happening? And I realized, and I actually had a conversation with this person on LinkedIn, but someone was messaging me on LinkedIn, and then basically I was ignoring it and trying to sell to me in my inbox. Not going to work. Software engineer. And then I guess they decided I'm going to go call Microsoft and ask for Nick Cosentino. So I have this random number calling me on my work computer. And first of all, I don't even get calls on Teams unless someone messages me and they're like, hey, is it okay if I call you? So random call comes in. I am not answering that. Like, I don't know what's happening. So yeah, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah. And, at Stackify, the second company I mentioned, we figured out how to do sales there from Google, organic SEO traffic, blogging. So I wrote like hundreds of blog posts and built the website. So eventually we got up to 10 million website visitors a year.
Wow.
From organic. And that worked really well,
But that was and sorry, just to clarify, that product was that was for software developers, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
So if
is
you went
that
and Googled, like .NET logging best practices or something, or .NET exception handling or whatever, like our website would show up in the top 10 for like all of those kinds of topics.
but that sort of that strategy in that case, instead of being like, how do I call the software engineers to be like, buy my stuff? The strategy in that case is like, we're just going to put out enough information on the internet because developers with that problem are going to be looking for it.
Yeah.
And if you can get in their face that way, then
Yep. And we at the height of that, we would get 1,000 people a month that would sign up for a free trial.
wow.
That's a lot of people signing up to try the software. So, the key to this conversation is, if you're a software developer and you're thinking about starting a business, that's a fantastic idea. But the big key to that is you got to know how to sell it. You got to know who your audience is and know what is your niche and how you're going to reach those people. Because
Right.
otherwise it's so difficult. Like you said, you're like, oh, we got ideas. We can build anything. But if you don't know how to sell it, you don't have anything. Like that.
Yeah.
That is so much of the struggle, and that's why I always say, like, so much of the go-to-market strategy is just as valuable or more valuable than the product and the code itself. Like people, like software developers, always write my code. Like, what if somebody stole my code? Like, good luck. They don't know how to sell your product anyways. Give them the code.
Yeah.
They don't know how to sell it anyways.
Are you giving it to a salesperson? Because otherwise you probably really don't have to worry.
Yeah, like some random software developers in China or whatever are not going to take your code and go compete with you. Like they don't know how to sell to your customers the same way you do, probably.
Right.
Or if it's that easy to sell to your customers, what do you have that's that unique anyways that's going to be a long-term defensible, business too, right?
Yeah.
So,
Is it really just like, I need to be the absolute first person to ship this so that I can get a couple bucks before the next person just does it?
You're going to have competition
seem like
anyways.
A very great idea.
Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to shift this a little bit because I think this is a really important topic about you're kind of touching on these different aspects of what it's going to take to have a successful business, right? It's not going to be just, a good product idea. It's not obviously just going to be code. If you flip it around, it's not just going to be just sales and marketing, because if there's nothing else there, then what are you selling and marketing? So in your current situation, you are running a company. There are hundreds of employees. I wanted to kind of hear about, as this scales up to this size, so you're bringing on, managers for multiple teams. How do you start like scaling these pieces up? Like whether it's, teams for sales and marketing, like how do you get the product focus into the engineering teams? Like all these pieces, how does that start to grow? And how do you make sure there's enough of that across the business so that you don't just have like an engineering team scaling up and you're like, holy crap, the engineers don't know anything about our business? Because based on all of your experiences, it sounds like that would be probably not the mindset you want to be in.
Well, I think the first and foremost is, for any kind of leader, one of the most important skills is learning to delegate, right? And it's super hard to do. And back to my point earlier where, 15 years ago or whatever, I wouldn't hire the marketing firm because I didn't want to delegate to them. I thought, I'll just figure it out on myself. Man, did I make a huge mistake. And the challenge is, you're never going to find, if you're really good at what you do, you're never going to find somebody that's going to do it as good as you will. You just won't. You probably won't. That doesn't mean you're not replaceable. That doesn't mean somebody else can't do it. But you're never going to find somebody that's going to do it exactly the same way as you. And you just have to accept that. And I don't remember where I heard this quote, but basically somebody said, like, if you can find somebody that can do it 80% as good as you would do it, it's perfect. And you just have to learn to live with, like, it's not going to be 100%. But if they will do whatever you want to do, like 80%, then just accept that and do that. So if it's like, I need somebody to run this team or run this product or whatever the thing is, just kind of go for that 80% rule. Like, it's not going to be perfect, and that's okay.
Right. And probably the whole concept of being perfect anyway in that situation is like, it's probably impossible to begin with, because if you yourself are not perfect, like you're not going to have someone model you perfectly. There's going to be error there. But getting someone 80% of the way, like that means that now your time can be shifted to something else entirely, right?
Well, and to your point, like they're not going to necessarily do, let's say they won't do like the product vision or maybe architecture or something like as perfectly as I would do it, but they probably do a bunch of other things better than I would do as well, right? Like there's right, it's give or take. So there's certain things they're not going to do maybe quite the same way that I would, but then there's other things they're probably better at as well that they bring in, right? And so it's just understanding what your strengths and weaknesses are, and not lying about it, right? Being honest with yourself about, you know what, I'm really good at these things and I can hire people to do these other things. And that's why I said earlier, like, I could never be a VP of engineering because I know it's just not my personality. Like, I know that. And so I know I'm more, a product and kind of architecture person, and just being honest with yourself about it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good note, because I think that if people, back to like soft skills and things like that, right? If you're not able to have that kind of introspection, you're never going to realize that, right? You're always going to be focused on, especially for people that are highly technical, like a lot of software engineers, right? If you're highly focused on just very technical things all the time, that ability to have introspection is perhaps lacking in a lot of people. And I think that goes a long way to be able to say, is this something I need to improve on? Is this something that I need to delegate? And especially as you get into more leadership type of positions, that becomes more and more critical.
I think going back to your question about product and kind of the product vision, product DNA, talking to customers, industry research, market research, like all these sort of things are important. And it's really difficult, right? And the bigger the company gets, the more difficult that is, the more layers of product management and product owners and all these different things.
That's especially I was interested in hearing from you, because as this is, you said it was like over 300 people, right? In your company.
So at my current company, Full Scale, we are working for our customers. So we have 60 or 70 customers, whatever. And so our employees do whatever they want them to do. So, it's really up to our customers, and if they have a product team or how they do things, right? We provide the software development talent, and basically it's like full-time contractors and like a staff aug model to our clients. And so it's
that's
kind of up for
hugely
clients.
Important detail. That detail is probably explaining exactly how you're able to try and get that customer focus, that product focus, because all of your engineering teams are directly tied to customers. Is that fair to say?
Well, and they're directly tied to our customers, right? But what our customers do could be a wide array of things, and then how close they are to their customers, I don't know, right? It's all over the board. A lot of our customers are smaller startups, and sometimes we're talking a lot with like one of the founders or CTO or whatever, or the CEO of the company. Somebody that really has that product vision. So we, our employees are going to get a lot of exposure to that. But some of our employees are also working for bigger companies and, some line of business on some certain team or whatever. And some of them are really well-established products like, oh, it's this insurance firm that's upgrading from some old version of Angular to new version of Angular or whatever the thing is. And let's say it's not as an exciting project, but it's just work that has to be done too. So, I mean, there's all sorts of work out there to do.
Interesting. Yeah, I think like that, I think explaining how that sort of how the company is laid out with respect to the engineers makes a big difference. I was starting to envision if you have these layers of hierarchy, like, teams and that are maybe they're horizontal to each other, like sibling teams. And then you start to layer in management and product owners and things like that. Like, I'm trying to think like my startup life compared to Microsoft, the hierarchy is just, it's world of difference in big tech. And like, I'm trying to think through like, how do we try to do a good job in big tech to do that? And it's very difficult. And I'm on a platform team now. I come from being in a place where people were talking directly with police officers. We had them coming into the office and presenting to us. And now I'm like, my customers are this other team that's building other software for Microsoft. Like, I know that we're helping the end users in the end, but like I don't feel that in my current position because I'm so far removed. It's
Yeah.
very different.
Well, I think this starts at a leadership level, even for my own companies in the past where I was one of the, have been one of the founders, it's making sure that even at the highest level, you spend enough time talking to your customers and understanding their problems. And I think there's a lot of, even smaller companies where that just doesn't happen enough, um, especially on the product side, if you're, head of product, head of engineering, CTO, whatever, any of those kinds of roles, trying to figure out how do I spend at least a certain amount of time on a monthly basis talking to customers, either be on sales calls or support calls or in some kind of engagement to just have your pulse on what are the customers saying, right? And it's really hard, as you said, like in a giant company like Microsoft, like how do you facilitate that is super hard. It's a challenge, but you just have to figure out how do you do that. And you're never going to necessarily get every single engineer in the whole company going to get that level of exposure, right? But the more people that you can, and in the management level, then that knowledge can help trickle down, right?
That's a really good point too, right? It doesn't have to be every single individual contributor gets FaceTime with customers, but if you have a big hierarchy, trying to find ways that closer to the individual contributors there is more exposure, that can certainly go a long way.
I mean, it's just like if you were building software for McDonald's, you'd be like, hey, you're going to go work the drive-thru once, right? It's like, you'll learn how this works at least once, like one day, go out there and, sit in their shoes and see what it's like. Like,
Yeah,
really
even
valuable.
as an engineering manager, when I've been put onto new teams at Microsoft, like I go onto the on-call rotations. And
Yeah.
for me, I'm like, oh, that sucks. Like, I don't want to be on call. No one does. But it's like, this is one of the best ways that you are going to learn what we have going on here. And it's like, you're right.
I mean, honestly, probably the biggest innovation in this part of it, and this seems funny to say this now, but you think back 20, 25 years ago, it's just freaking screen sharing. Like, right? Like 20, 25 years ago, if one of my customers had a problem, like I'm on the phone with them trying to have them explain to me, like, oh, okay, I click this button and I get an error, on error, resume next, or, whatever stupid VB6 error, right? Like, the solution is on error, resume next. That's the only solution. But how do you troubleshoot that, right? Well, today we're like, hey, let me just jump on a Zoom call or whatever, and let's look at it. Well, 20 years ago, you couldn't do that. 25 years ago, right? It was a whole different world. So it's like the little things like that have made it easier, right? From a product perspective, like seeing the users use the product, being able to watch that, all that kind of stuff, right? Is so much easier now than it was 20, 25 years ago. But
yeah, that's a really good point. Well, I was thinking that as you were chatting, I think one of the most important things that I've kind of heard, like there's a lot of value in everything you've been saying, but one thing that I really wanted to remind myself, and I think it's good for other people to hear, is especially from a leadership position, and it's not just leadership, but I think especially, like you talked about delegation, and I think one of the critical things that can make that effective is finding out for yourself your own strengths and weaknesses and being able to have that introspection so that you can delegate effectively. The flip side to that is understanding the other individuals that you're going to be delegating to, of course. But for me, that was a really important takeaway. That's like, if you're not able to do that for yourself, then like, how are you ever going to expect to delegate with any kind of effectiveness? So yeah, I thought that was helpful.
Yeah, I think the other key thing is understanding how important requirements and all the other product pieces are. So a year ago, I wrote a post on LinkedIn and it went super viral. It got over 1 million views, which was stupid crazy. But it was basically that instead of hiring rock star developers, you need rock star requirements.
Okay.
Because it's like, you can take an average developer and give them rock star requirements and you'll probably be way ahead, right? And it struck a nerve on all sides, and that's why it went super viral on LinkedIn. Because as developers, we never get good requirements; they're always crap. And then on the same side, like, do rockstar developers even actually exist? They do exist, but that's why it kind of struck a nerve, and it went viral, and it was funny. But to this day, it's something I post a lot about on LinkedIn. It's like so much of this is about product and requirements. If you don't get the product vision, the requirements, the planning, the roadmap, all these things correct, none of the engineering matters. And it is so easy in all phases of life, not just in engineering, to be busy. You're like, oh, we're writing code, we're doing this thing, we're upgrading this framework, we're switching from this JSON parser to this JSON parser because it's faster or whatever, like all this stuff. Probably most of that crap doesn't even matter. Like, it doesn't even matter. It could just be busy work, right? You're like, well, we needed something for the team to do, so we did this thing. Versus if you had like a very clear roadmap and priorities of like what really mattered to the users, right? You might do things a lot differently. But I feel like the bigger a company gets, like that becomes so much of the whirlwind of the work that gets done. It's like maintenance and like, well, we hired this new guy who thinks we should, use Kafka or whatever. And that would be the greatest thing in the world. And we're going to switch to Kafka. Yeah, I know what we have works, but we need to use Kafka, right? Like, it feels like that is like the only work that gets done in these big companies is like that, right? And there's so much of like a product road mapping and all this stuff that falls apart.
And I can imagine people finding like that's striking a nerve for them on the software engineering side because they're like, you said it right. Well, there's no such thing as perfect requirements. And your point is like nailing the requirements. If you can do that, will make this better. So you're not saying, hey, look, I have the perfect requirements. You're saying
it's hard.
Better you can get.
It's super hard. And I've been guilty myself of like, well, and teams need time to do maintenance work, right? It's not that they need time to do that. Like, upgrading. You're not
saying that there's no value in that. Yeah.
No, I mean, I pity the people now that are stuck on .NET, 4.8 or whatever, and they're like, okay, how are we going to move to .NET 8.0 and all that kind of stuff? Like, I don't want to deal with that. That sounds like a nightmare. But at some point in time, you have to do it, right?
Yeah.
And so that kind of work has to be done. But my point is, at the larger companies, it feels like that is the only work that they do. It's like you hire new developers and like, all this old code that's 20 years old, it's crap. We need to rewrite it all. And it's like, you just forever like polishing the turd, right? It's just like maintenance work that gets done. But anyways, I think the key is the more you can perfect the requirements, the product vision, the better. And honestly, a lot of it starts with the product vision. The bigger a company gets, the product vision dies and goes away. And so my company, Vin Solutions, I started 20 years ago, is the number one CRM system in all of automotive. So like 30-40% of every car dealer in the United States uses that software today in 2024. It's still the number one product. If you looked at that software today, it looks exactly the same as it did 13 years ago when I sold it. The icons are the same crappy icons that I made with
but
some
the
crappy.
Customers care about the icons.
And it just works too. The software just works. But the problem is the people that run the company now don't have the product vision or the risk appetite to change it, right? And that's why big companies software like slowly dies, because nobody there wants to be the guy that like, well, I changed the icon and we got all these phone calls and everybody's mad, or we redid the whole UX and the whole UI and nobody likes the new, like nobody wants to get fired for that, right? So there's just not a risk appetite to make those big changes, because now there's like tens of thousands of people that use this software every day, right? Like all these users, like they're scared to go make these radical UX changes and UI changes and product changes, right? So the product vision kind of dies. Like it's been in maintenance mode for 13 years because everybody's scared to make those big changes. And that's just inevitable what happens in software.
It's like safer to change to Kafka than it is to go change something that the users might experience.
Right. So the developers on the backside are like doing those sort of projects because those sound fun and exciting. And we're like, well, that won't screw up the user, so that's fine. We can do that.
Right.
I literally talked to one of my developers that still works there, and they were doing some weird like Elasticsearch project for that reason. Or like, well, if we didn't do this, we didn't know what we were going to do. So it's like, okay, all right, man.
Get to learn about Elasticsearch at least.
Yeah, whatever.
Well, Matt, I'll ask offline for this as well, but do you want to share with listeners and viewers where they can find you? And then I'll make sure that I have your information and descriptions and comments and stuff, and then people can
Okay.
check you out.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for having me on the show. If you want to learn more about what I do, I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Fullscale. As I mentioned before, we have like 60, 70 different customers that we do software development for. I have about 300 employees in the Philippines that do all sorts of software development, different programming languages, front end, back end, mobile, QA, all different things. You can check us out at fullscale.io. But I also host a podcast about entrepreneurship called Startup Hustle. I also write a blog at visionarycto.com, and you can follow me on LinkedIn. I post on LinkedIn almost every day. So, yeah,
It's
absolutely.
true.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, well, thanks, Matt. No, I definitely appreciate the time. It's I wish Graham was here. Graham was sick, but yeah, like we always say that, like even when it's just Graham and I talking, we learn so much from each other, and we've known each other for years. And having guests on like yourself, like just the different experiences, the different perspectives, it's so valuable. So thank you for your time, and I'm sure that people watching and listening are going to have a lot to take away as well. So thanks again.
Absolutely. And probably my best advice for anybody is if you want the best experience in the world when it comes to software development, you really want to work at the smallest company you can work for. You will get the best experience. You'll wear all the hats and have exposure to all the things, right? Because the bigger the company is, the smaller the piece of the pie that you work on, and you just don't get the same exposure. So that's probably my best advice for anybody. If you really want to learn software development, go work for the smallest company there is.
Yep, I started with startups, and I would totally vouch for that. So thanks again, Matt.
Thank you.